Hello. Welcome to Soothing Words with Steph. This story is called Two Souls Reunited. I wrote this story about 2004, so more than 20 years ago now. He met her that sunny day in late August. It was a perfect day for a walk in the park. Since his old body couldn't handle the extreme weather, he hadn't been outside a lot during the hot summer days. He was now very glad for the cool breeze. Edward stopped walking once he saw her. She was sitting on a wooden bench along the riverbank, staring out at the water without really seeing it. She was deep in thought, but she would occasionally stop staring long enough to feed the ducks as they swam in circles, quacking and waiting for the next handful of sunflower seeds. She was just as beautiful as the first time he had laid his eyes on her. Her white, silvery hair glowed in the bath of the sunlight. He thought he was looking at an angel. A beautifully handcrafted cane was at her side, leaning against the bench. He leaned against his own worn cane and stood there in wonder at the sight of her. The arthritis that had plagued him for years crept to his hands, and he started to tremble. He leaned against the huge trunk of the willow tree and regained his strength. It's now or never, Edward thought as he hobbled over to the bench where she was sitting peacefully. "Hello, Ruth," he said in a surprisingly firm tone. She looked up at him and smiled. "I knew you would come," she spoke tenderly. Her eyes met his, and within just a few moments, a lifetime of communication passed between them. "I wouldn't have missed it for the world," he said as he smiled back. "Though my old bones are stubborn, I would have made it, whether the day brought forth rain, snow, or hail. That is how much I love you." Ruth sighed in contentment as his words rang through her ears. With difficulty, Edward sat down beside her. They both sat in momentary silence as they stared at the ducks swimming in the rippling water. Edward's voice broke the stillness as he closed his eyes and softly started to sing. I'll be seeing you. Our song, Ruth whispered. She laid her hand over Edward's rough, gnarled one. You remembered? Yes, my dear. I may forget where I live on occasion, and I may not remember what I did yesterday, but that song and the memory of it will stay with me as long as I live. And you will stay with me here. He lifted her hand and grasped it to his heart. She felt his heart beat under her fingertips. Ruth rested her head on his shoulder, and there they sat together while the sun started to set and the colors of the world stretched across the sky in a haze of glory. Quiet moments passed as they reflected on the meaning the song had on their lives. Edward broke the silence with a somber tone in his voice. I'm sorry to hear about James's passing. Yes, thank you. He was a good man. Ruth paused for a few moments. I'm sorry to hear about Rose. She was such a sweetheart. It's unfortunate I lost touch with her after you two married. But it's just as well, for I could not bear to have seen you two together. I know, my darling Ruth. I know. Memories flooded Ruth's mind and spread to her heart as tears streamed down her face. James was a wonderful husband and father, and I did love him. She stopped as she drew a deep breath to calm her feelings. But I do often wonder how different our lives would have been had you and I married. If you had not been the son of a poor farmer, and I had not been the governor's daughter. If mother and father had only given their blessing. Her words faded as they pondered what could have been. No use in trying to reinvent the past. We can't live out the rest of our days living in regret. What matters is that we are here now, together, and we have both led good lives, with love. Edward breathed a heavy sigh, even if not with each other. I know you're right. You are always right. And don't you forget it, Edward replied as he smiled with a twinkle in his eyes. The sun was lowering, and darkness was starting to creep in on the two aged souls sitting side by side. I think it's time to go home for the night, Edward. You're right. I'm getting tired. Edward held onto the bench as he stood up. He extended his arm to Ruth and helped her stand up. Same time tomorrow, my dear? It's a date. Good night, dear Edward. Good night, my darling Ruth. It was another glorious sunny day when they met again. This time it was Edward who was waiting as Ruth approached the bench. The weather seems to agree with us, Edward said without looking up. His heart skipped a beat as he felt Ruth's presence. I'd like to think that God is giving us his blessing and that James and Rose are smiling down on us in agreement, Ruth remarked as she sat down. Yes, Edward murmured. Ruth took Edward's hand in hers and leaned into him. Her emotions soared just like the first time they had held hands. She remembered that day like it was yesterday. Edward had asked her to go for a walk. They had strolled under the moonlight in the park and sat at the very bench they were sitting on now. He had reached for her hand, and there they sat until the sun had set. She had been 18 years old, and he had been 20. Young love, so new and so pure, and yet she felt as though she were that age once again. She looked down at their reflection in the water and sighed. We are not that young anymore. But at least we have found each other once more before it's too late, she thought to herself. Are you thinking about our last night together? Edward inquired as he turned to Ruth. Pain crossed his face as he remembered. Actually, I was just remembering the first time you held my hand. That was the most romantic day of my life, Ruth said as she smiled. But then her face turned grave as she said softly, But I do remember our last night. That was the most I had ever cried. Me too, Edward whispered as his voice choked. Your parents had found out about us. When they caught us kissing in the shed, they were furious. I could hear them yelling at you from where I had been waiting outside. Then your father came out and forbid me to see you. My parents had sent me to my room, but I snuck out and ran after you. We came to this very spot and promised to love each other no matter what. Ruth sighed. Then I met James, and my father arranged our marriage right away. I left you a note under this bench the night of my engagement. I met Rose later that year, and we were married. And even though I loved her, you were in my thoughts and in my heart every day. I held on to this note and waited 70 years to see you again. I think ours is a romantic story, a tragic one, and yet a happy story also. Edward agreed. The very best. They sat together in the calm of the late afternoon, holding each other and talking from time to time. On that same bench later that evening, they both breathed their last breath in quiet surrender as their old, tired bodies gave out. Edward and Ruth were reunited eternally at last. Now, Edward and Ruth receive many visitors who walk by their gravestone and wonder about these two people who were so in love. It is said that anyone who stops to read these words, which are forever engraved on their tombstone, will find true happiness and love for the rest of their lives. Ruth McLean Davidson and Edward Mackenzie. Though the day may end, though years may pass us by, we will find a way to each other. Eternally, you are mine, and I am yours. At last reunited forever. Thank you for listening to Two Souls Reunited, written by me, Stephanie Ann Webb. If you enjoyed Soothing Words with Steph, please follow, subscribe, like, and comment so you'll be notified the next time an episode comes out. Sending love to you all.